Good afternoon, everyone. Very good to see folks here. And to those I haven't had a chance to say this to, Happy New Year. This morning, NATO's North Atlantic Council met to discuss our coordinated response to Russia's military buildup along the Ukraine border and its increasingly sharp threats and inflammatory rhetoric. I want to thank NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg for bringing us together. As he said in his own press conference a short while ago, Russia's aggressive actions are a threat to peace and security in Europe. We're prepared to respond forcefully to further Russian aggression. But a diplomatic solution is still possible and preferable if Russia chooses it. That's what we, together with our allies and partners, will continue to pursue intently next week at the Strategic Stability Dialogue between the United States and Russia, and at the meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ahead of these urgent discussions, let's be clear about how we got to this moment. In 2014, the Ukrainian people chose a democratic and European future for themselves. Russia responded by manufacturing a crisis and invading. Ever since, Russia has occupied Ukraine's territory in Crimea and has orchestrated a war in the eastern part of Ukraine with proxies that it leads, trains, supplies, and finances, that has killed nearly 14,000 people and redrawn Ukraine's borders by force. Beyond its military aggression, Moscow has also worked to undermine Ukraine's democratic institutions. It's interfered in Ukraine's politics and elections. It's blocked energy and commerce to intimidate its leaders and pressure its citizens. It's used propaganda and disinformation to sow mistrust. It's launched cyber attacks on the country's critical infrastructure. Then, starting last March and continuing through the fall, Russia began a massive, unprovoked buildup of military forces and equipment on Ukraine's border. Nearly 100,000 troops today, with plans to mobilize twice that number on very short order. So how does Moscow explain its actions? With disinformation. It claims that Ukraine is threatening Russia, that Ukraine seeks to provoke a conflict, and that the Russian troop buildup and the tanks and heavy artillery are all purely defensive. That's like the fox saying it had to attack the henhouse because its occupants somehow pose a threat. We've seen this gaslighting before. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, it claimed that Ukraine was the aggressor to justify pre-planned military action. And again today, we see a significant effort to push propaganda against Ukraine, NATO, and the United States. That includes malign social media operations, the use of overt and covert online proxy media outlets, the infection of disinformation into TV and radio programming, hosting conferences designed to influence attendees into falsely believing that Ukraine, not Russia, is at fault for heightened tensions in the region, and the leveraging of cyber operations to deface media outlets and conduct hack and release operations, that is, hacking and then releasing private data and communications. No one should be surprised if Russia instigates a provocation or incident, then tries to use it to justify military intervention, hoping that by the time the world realizes the ruse, it'll be too late. The idea that Ukraine is the aggressor in this situation is absurd. It's Russia that invaded Ukraine nearly 8 years ago. It's Russia that is the military occupier of part of Ukraine in Crimea. It's Russia that to this day is fueling a war in eastern Ukraine. It's Russia that has failed to implement any of its Minsk commitments, indeed is actively violating many of them, and refuses to acknowledge it's a party to the conflict. It's Russia that's taken aim repeatedly at Ukraine's democracy. And it's Russia that's sending troops to Ukraine's border once again. All these actions are violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and an immediate and urgent challenge to peace and stability in Europe. It's also worth noting that Moscow is simultaneously driving the false narrative that NATO is threatening Russia, that NATO plans to station military infrastructure in Ukraine to stir conflict with Russia, that NATO swore after the Cold War not to admit countries in Eastern Europe, and that NATO has broken those promises. Each of those claims is false. NATO is a defensive alliance. It exists to protect not to attack. That's why, after the Cold War, NATO greatly reduced its conventional and nuclear forces, because NATO didn't need to maintain the same defensive posture any longer. From then on, NATO didn't strengthen its defensive posture in Europe until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. And even then, it was done in a limited and measured fashion to be prepared to meet further Russian military action against members of the alliance. Additionally, NATO never promised not to admit new members. It could not and would not. The open door policy was a core provision of the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty that founded NATO. The Russian president at the end of the Cold War, Mikhail Gorbachev, was asked directly about this in an interview in 2014 and said very clearly that the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all in negotiations about German reunification that led to the end of the Cold War. There was no promise that NATO wouldn't expand. Secretary of State James Baker said the same thing. Membership in the alliance has always been a decision between NATO and countries that aspire to belong, no one else. And in the Istanbul Charter for European Security, Russia itself affirmed the right of countries to choose or change the security arrangements that they have, including alliances. Russia is now demanding that both the United States and NATO sign treaties to withdraw NATO forces stationed in the territory of allies in Central and Eastern Europe and to prohibit Ukraine from ever joining NATO. They want to draw us into a debate about NATO rather than focus on the matter at hand, which is their aggression toward Ukraine. We won't be diverted from that issue, because what's happening in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine. It's part of a broader pattern of destabilizing, dangerous, and often illegal behavior by Moscow as it tries to build a sphere of influence that covers the countries that were once under Soviet dominion, and to stop them from realizing their democratic aspirations as fully sovereign, independent nations. Let's remember that over the past 2 decades, Russia invaded 2 neighboring countries, Ukraine and Georgia, and maintains troops and munitions in Moldova against the will of the government. It's interfered in elections in many nations, including our own. It's used chemical weapons to try to assassinate opponents of the Russian government, including poisoning Sergei and Yulia Skripal when they were on NATO allied territory in England. It's violated international arms control agreements, pulled back from long-established confidence building and transparency measures, supported violent dictators, enabled crimes against humanity in places like Syria. Moscow's actions have threatened to set a new precedent on European soil whereby basic international principles that are vital to peace and security are up for debate, that the borders and territorial integrity of a state cannot be changed by force, that it is the inherent right of citizens in a democracy to make their country's decisions and determine their country's future, that all members of the international community are bound by common rules and should face costs if they don't live up to the solemn commitments that they make. These principles transcend Ukraine. They transcend Europe. They are the fundamental rules that underpin the international order that together we have sought to build, to sustain, and as necessary adapt. In challenging them, Russia seeks to challenge the international system itself and to unravel our transatlantic alliance, erode our unity, pressure democracies into failure. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. We are fully committed to meaningful, reciprocal dialogue with Russia, just as we're fully committed to consulting and coordinating with our allies and partners, including the European Union, in all our discussions in all formats. We would far prefer a diplomatic path and a diplomatic solution to a crisis that Russia has brought forth. That's what next week's meetings of the U.S.-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue, the NATO-Russia Council, and the OSCE are all about. And we believe that there are areas where we can make progress. If Russia has legitimate concerns about our actions, the United States, our NATO allies, our OSCE partners are willing to hear them and to try to address them, if the Kremlin is prepared to reciprocate regarding its own dangerous and destabilizing behavior. Next week, we'll reconfirm our readiness to increase transparency, institute new risk reduction measures, and renew efforts to address nuclear and conventional threats to European security. But again, it has to be a two-way street. Our goal is to have a relationship with Russia that is predictable and stable so that we can cooperate when it's in our mutual interest and address our differences with an open and frank dialogue. It'll be very difficult to make actual progress if Russia continues to escalate its military buildup and its inflammatory rhetoric. And we've been clear with Russia about what it will face if it continues on this path, including economic measures that we haven't used before, massive consequences. That clarity has been powerfully echoed in recent weeks by the G7, the world's leading democratic economies, by the European Union, and by NATO. So we hope Russia makes a different choice. And again, we're fully committed to diplomacy and to seeing if we can produce results. After all, Russia and the United States have done it before, even during times of great tension. We negotiated the Helsinki Accords. We created the OSCE. We signed the INF Treaty and other arms control agreements. Just this week, we joined forces to issue a statement with all permanent members of the UN Security Council to affirm that a nuclear war cannot be won and so should never be fought. We committed to our work together on the space station, and we're working together to bring Iran back into compliance with the JCPOA. We achieve these things through mutual understanding, reciprocity, and full consultation and coordination with our allies and with everyone whose interests were represented. That's exactly what we'll seek to do again next week and beyond. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.